Well, hello and welcome to today's episode of Breaking the Taboo. And we're now on series 3 of the podcast, and I've had so many listeners writing in with questions about baby bonding and the importance of the first 1001 critical days of a baby's life. So I'm delighted that we're going to have a special episode today to talk about this. And with me in the studio, I have Dame Andrea Leadsom, who's the founder of the 1001 Critical Days Foundation. And Dame Andrea has been a tireless advocate for babies and their families for nearly 30 years. And prior to her distinguished political career, she founded several charities supporting babies in the UK. You may know her as the Minister and the UK Government's Early Years Advisor, where she previously developed a national vision for the 1001 Critical Days and led the rollout of the pioneering Family Hubs and Start for Life programme. And we're also joined by Dr. Matt Price, who is a clinical psychologist and Director of Research and Grants at the 1001 Critical Days Foundation. He's led a parent-infant relationship service in the NHS and was the strategic lead for clinical psychology and psychotherapy at the UK's largest children's charity. He's also designed perinatal mental health and parent-infant relationships as part of Family Hubs and the Start for Life programme at the Department for Health and Social Care. So can I welcome you both to today's episode of Breaking the Taboo, and it's fantastic to have you with us to discuss such an important subject that many mums and families have written to me about. And perhaps, Andrea, we could start with you. And you've become such a huge champion for this area of policy. So perhaps we could start there of why was it that you became so interested in supporting new mums and particularly help for their babies?
Well, thanks, Theo. Thanks for having me. I guess it all began really with my mum about 30 years ago because she trained as a midwife, but then went on to become a trauma counsellor because she discovered in her midwifery practice that so many women actually suffer traumatic incidents during the birth process. And very often, if it's diagnosed at all, it's diagnosed as postnatal depression. And in fact, her thesis was, no, it's actually post-traumatic stress disorder. And she lectured around the world on that. And so I got interested in it, as you do with anything that your mum's up to. But then really for me, it was when I had my first child. And I really suffered with postnatal depression. I was doing a big job in banking. I'd just been promoted. I was offered this promotion provided I came back after 8 weeks. And stupidly, as you do, I said, yes, this will be fine. It's only a baby. But of course, it was an extremely difficult birth. It was written down in my notes, I think, as a 40-hour labour. And I started off with just gas and air for about the first 16 hours and then was moved to the local hospital because I was in a midwifery unit before. And in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, I was obviously strapped down, which when you're in full labour is actually horrifying anyway for a 40-minute journey. And then when I got there, my husband was with me, and I just remember the midwives just rushing me in, and they just wouldn't tell me anything. They were sort of attaching straps to me, and my husband got quite angry, actually saying, "What are you doing? You have to talk to us. Talk to us." Anyway, the midwife walked off the job saying, "Fine, that's it then, I'm not helping you." And it was just, the whole thing was just horrendous. And in the end, I had an epidural and was, the birth was induced, so the labour pains were extremely strong. And then I think just fell into a sleep and woke up to find I was being urged to push but couldn't feel anything. And just as the epidural wore off, my beautiful boy appeared. And then I was given sort of 10 silk stitches with the epidural having worn off. So I think it was my punishment for being so upset when I got there. Anyway, so it was a pretty traumatic, but nothing like some women suffer. But certainly it was enough to really send me into a bit of a spiral. And so I certainly had about 3 months of, well, I don't know how severe the postnatal depression was, but certainly Fred, my son, didn't sleep for more than about 2 hours at a time. And I was breastfeeding, and that in itself was quite challenging when you're so sleep deprived, as every woman is. And it just used to be the case that he would cry and I would cry. And my mum was just like, oh no, my daughter, what's going on? I was the first in my siblings to have a child. And of course, she felt quite hopeless because this was her subject and she didn't know what to do. So anyway, it was a bit of an awful situation, but he's now almost 30 and survived and thrived. And actually, I went back to work and that really snapped me out of the postnatal depression. I'm not sure I would advocate that for anyone else, but it gave me a lifelong, I think, just understanding and empathy for any woman who goes through that, because you cannot imagine what it's like until it happens to you. And actually, one of my abiding memories is it was Christmas. It was just after Christmas he was born. And I was sitting in my house looking out the windows and they were all smeary. And I was thinking, I need a window cleaner and I just don't know how to even begin to find a window cleaner. And I just remember sitting there in absolute sobs because I had dirty windows, and it's just that memory stays with me and I'm like, what on earth was wrong with me, you know? But actually, for any woman going through that, it is horrendous. Doesn't matter. You know, I've had so many journalists say to me, yes, but you were well off, you had a supportive husband, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't matter. Everyone has their own story, their own problems, and you just need people around you. You desperately need support, people to tell you, don't worry, it's going to get better, it'll be all right. And, you know, I've always been incredibly close to that firstborn. Well, all three of mine actually are very, very close relationships. But with that first experience, it was just so difficult. So it's hard to ever forget that.
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you so much for sharing. And the point of this podcast is to break the taboo by talking about it, because there does seem to be a stigma in society, particularly about, I think, mental health for new mums. And Matt, if I could bring you in, I mean, we've been talking on this podcast a lot about birth trauma and how mums who particularly had a difficult birth with complications, where something's gone not to plan, has really impacted on their physical and mental health post-birth. But we also know that it can impact on baby bonding. So could you just talk to us a bit about parent-infant relationships and particularly what the impact of a mum who's had a difficult birth might have on that?
Of course. Well, I think Andrea's description really of her birth experience really perfectly illustrates how birth trauma is a really unique type of trauma. So, in any other part of your life, if you experience a traumatic event, life might slow down, maybe pressures in other parts of your life would be alleviated. But when you have a trauma that's related to a birth, the pressure is amped up. You've got to immediately start caring for a baby. You might lose some of the support systems that were previously around you. For example, if you were working previously and then all of a sudden you're on maternity leave and your friends aren't as available to you. So there's something really unique about the type of trauma that's experienced when it's about a birth and the immediate pressures and sleep deprivation that mums can experience afterwards. So it's really understandable in that context for mums to struggle to build a relationship with their baby. And that can be for loads of different reasons. So there's very rarely kind of one reason why a traumatic birth might make it difficult to bond with your baby. But it can be really hard to talk about. So it's brilliant that you're breaking the taboo on today's podcast, Theo. So one of the reasons might be that at some level, mums might feel really quite guilty that they're struggling to build a relationship with their baby. They might be feeling guilty that they didn't have the birth experience that they had, that they planned for, that they wanted, that they dreamt of. They might be feeling really frustrated with their baby. You know, how dare you cry, baby, when I've gone through all of this and I just don't know how to care for you. I don't want to care for you right now. Those are huge thoughts that for us to have as new parents when nobody really prepares themselves to have those thoughts. And it can feel really isolating. So then you have this kind of double struggle of a traumatic birth leading to really normal thoughts of, I just don't want to care for this baby. With then an extra layer of thought of, actually, I can't tell anyone that I'm struggling in this way because that's not okay for new parents. So it's a whole cocktail of experiences that happens around this really difficult time of having a traumatic birth.
That's so helpful. And for anyone who's listening who's particularly interested in support for mental health, do check out our episode in series 1, where we have a psychiatrist on to talk about the different types of therapy that are available. And Andrea, you've been a huge advocate and a champion for the 1001 critical days. Some of our listeners may not know enough about that and that critical time in a baby's life. So could you just explain to us what that is and why it's so a crucial part of a baby's journey in those first few days?
Absolutely. And this is fundamental. If we want to make the world a better place, we need everyone to understand the critical 1001 days, which is the period from the beginning of pregnancy to about the age of 2. And essentially, human beings are born about 2 years premature. So if you think about it, a cat or an elephant or a tiger, they are born, they stand up, they look around, they can fend for themselves. Human beings cannot do that at all. We're born and then we are utterly vulnerable, and we rely entirely on a loving adult carer to help us in every single way. So a newborn baby, if it's crying, it doesn't know that it's cold, it doesn't know it's pooed its nappy, it doesn't know it's hungry, it just knows something's wrong. And so a baby can only cry, sleep, or look around. Those are its options. So babies are uniquely cute and gorgeous, and the idea is that they make that loving adult carer fall in love with them. They've got those cute little arms and those big limpid eyes, and they reach out to you and gurgle sweetly and so on. And the idea is that the adult will soothe your feelings, will sort out whatever is wrong, and enable you to relax again. And so what's happening in the baby is that when you're born, you just have the amygdala, the flight or fight part of the brain. You don't have the whole social and empathetic part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex that develops once you're in the region of 6 months to 18 months old, is the peak period of development. And that's the bit that enables the baby to become a social and empathetic human being. It's almost the thing that differentiates us from other animals. And that part of the brain, that social and empathetic part of the brain, that develops as a result of the things that we do with our babies, like peekaboo and gazing into their eyes and grinning at them when they smile at you and sticking your tongue out at them when they stick their tongue out at you, and playing peekaboo and aren't you gorgeous? I love you so much. And all of those things that we do enable the baby to think this world is an okay place, everything's going to be fine. And the baby's brain makes around 1 billion connections a minute in the first year of life. And so the baby is uniquely vulnerable to his or her environment. Everything that happens in that period from the womb up to about the age of 2 has profound consequences in terms of the baby's then instincts for life. So a baby that is loved and securely attached, we call it, attached to a loving adult carer, will develop an instinct for life that says, do you know, I can cope. The world's generally a good place. Things will be fine. And that baby will grow up to be much better able to cope with life's ups and downs. Whereas the baby that is neglected or left to cry for long, long, long periods of time. I mean, we all leave our babies to cry. This isn't about turning parents into sort of prisoner of the baby at all. But a baby where the parents are perhaps, because of depression, because of their own problems with mental health or addictions or their own domestic violence issues and so on, a baby that's neglected and left to its own devices actually that will become its instinct for life. That baby will learn that the world isn't a great place, and that actually I either need to protect myself or I need to fight my way out of this place. And so that tiny baby is all the time learning from its earliest environment, and that has huge consequences for our society. And that's really what's made me passionate about this, is that it is very clear to me that if we want a happier and healthier society right across the world, then we could do no better than looking at supporting families in that 1001 critical days. And actually for all of us to understand what it is, we all, when we've got a baby and we're in a supermarket and the baby's crying, we're not thinking about the baby, we're thinking, what's everyone thinking about me? Are they thinking I'm a bad parent? We're all terribly vulnerable to what everyone around us thinks. But actually what we should be doing is supporting each other. This new baby, you need my help, I need your help. We all need it. It takes a village to raise a child. We all need to be much more empathetic and understanding about each other's parenting journey.
That's so true. And I was struck by your comment just then about how it takes a whole village to raise a child. And we know we've got dads also listening to the podcast. And Matt, could we talk a bit about impacts on the wider family? Because I've been reading messages on Instagram and TikTok that we've received from listeners, and a lot of mums feel a real shame, particularly about if they've had issues about bonding with their baby, and same for the father. So what is the impact on the wider family? And do you have any advice for them if they are having struggles with that?
Well, I think first of all, it's brilliant that people are getting in touch and starting to talk about this. I think for a long time we considered that birth trauma was just something that mums could experience, or even that perinatal mental health difficulties were just something that mums would experience. So starting to recognize that actually vicarious trauma, so a dad or a partner looking at a birthing mum and experiencing that trauma on their behalf as they watch, is actually a huge cause of distress for lots of partners. And if I think back to when my firstborn was born, we had almost the opposite labor, Andrea, where my wife gave birth from 0 centimeters dilated to the baby in arms in 20 minutes.
Wow.
So a very different experience, but there was a lot of distress in the room, both from the professionals and from my wife and me. And I remember somebody saying afterwards, "Oh, well, you didn't give birth, so it doesn't really matter kind of what your experience of that was." And I thought, gosh, right. That's the place that we, as society, place dads, even when they're experiencing some pretty distressing times. And maybe at moments in that birthing process, worried about whether they're going to lose the baby and their partner. So I think, first of all, we need to acknowledge that birth trauma can affect a whole family system. It's a bit like a stone dropping in a lake and seeing the ripples come out. There's a baby, there's a mum, and there's a whole family system that's impacted by that. Andrea shared what her mum's experience was of seeing her daughter experiencing a traumatic birth. So first of all, we need to recognize that it can impact on everyone. And also, this episode, we're focusing on bonding. And if dads are experiencing vicarious trauma, then that can have a real impact on the bond that they build with their baby as well. So first of all, we need to recognize that that can have an impact. And then next, we need to start talking about it. So whether that's communication within that family, kind of being able to share really honestly, even the bits of our experiences as a new parent that we're not necessarily proud of, being brave enough to share that with each other is a really important step. But I also know that lots of practitioners listen to this podcast, Theo. And so my plea to them is to openly ask, without any judgment, questions around birth trauma, not just to mum, but to dads, partners, other family members that are important within that household, what their experience of that birth was like, and any impact that that birth is having on their relationship with the baby.
That's so helpful. And we do have a lot of dads listening. In fact, in our first series, we did an episode with Dad Matters and Fatherhood Solutions, which had a huge response from the public. So if there are any dads listening today, do check out that specific episode to give you some practical support on dealing if your partner's had a traumatic birth. And I'm really interested to give anyone listening today some really practical advice about where to access services, particularly on perinatal mental health for new mums. So Andrea, could you just explain what is a family hub? And how do families go about getting access to support in their local area in the UK?
Absolutely. So the first thing to say is that the family hubs are the result of a very lengthy consultation with parents and carers, professionals, academics, talking to all sorts of people, single parents, migrant parents, professional parents, young parents, older parents, carers, grandparents, about what is it that they think would really help them in that sort of parenting and caring journey. And the output, the thing that everybody had in common was three things they wanted. One was information, and that is so important. So if you're having a cancer operation, you'll be given all of the knowledge that you need about what's going to happen and when this happens and when that happens. But if you're having a baby, so many families think, I don't really know what to expect. I don't know where to go for this or that. So information was number one. Number two, is parents don't want to be singled out. Nobody wants to feel stigmatized that, I'm getting this special attention because someone thinks I'm going to be a bad parent or someone thinks I am a bad parent. So the second thing that people want is to not be stigmatized. So they want to know that wherever they're getting their help and support, everybody else is going there too. So it's, if you like, it's like going to the GP or going to Tesco. There's nothing to see here because everyone goes there. So non-stigmatizing, universal place. And then the third thing everybody said, without any exception, is that they want a one-stop shop. So they want to be able to go to one place, not sort of that end of town for the midwife and the other end of town for the health visitor and somewhere else altogether if you want mental health support. They want a one-stop shop. So that was the idea behind the family hubs, is that it would be a single place where you would have all of the services that you might need, ranging from antenatal checks through to weighing the baby, to breastfeeding or infant feeding support, to oral hygiene, to stopping smoking help, antenatal classes, transition to fatherhood for new dads, time for me, mental health support, relationship support, all of the different services that people might want would all be in one place in a family hub. But it wouldn't just be the place, there would also be the spokes. So you've got the hub, which is a big place, lots of rooms, lots of things going on. And then you've got the spokes, which is Tuesday morning in your village, in a town hall, we're bringing the services to you. And then you would also have the virtual, because in particular, some people, let's say they've got, I don't know, a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old and a bump. They can't quite face getting to the family hub. Some people do have birth injuries and they're not very mobile and they'd just rather be in a virtual environment. And the beauty of COVID lockdown is we all learnt how to do things virtually. So a lot of family hubs will now also offer either hybrid or purely virtual antenatal, postnatal, mental health support, etc. So that's really important. So you've got the hub, you've got the spoke, and you've got the virtual services. And so those family hubs are universal. They're open to everybody. And there is on the NHS website a postcode finder. So you can put in your postcode and find out where your nearest family hub is. And in addition, every local authority that has family hubs is required to have what we call a Start for Life offer, which means that they must have very clearly written on paper, digitally, available in many cases on an app or on a QR code, all of the services in your area that are available to you. So I do strongly recommend anybody with a child or a bump or a baby to actually go and look at their nearest family hub and see what's available to them.
That's really helpful advice. And for anyone listening to today's show who doesn't have a pen, don't panic. We have show notes for you and there'll be hyperlinks to some of these resources being mentioned today. And Matt, if I could bring you in, I'm particularly interested in the types of services that mums can access, and particularly on the mental health side. Andrea talked there about postnatal depression. And I think we hear from a lot of mums that they sometimes feel too ashamed to ask for help. And one thing we're really trying to do with Breaking the Taboo is to encourage mums that if they need help, that they should ask. So could you just talk a bit about that and anything else you'd like to add?
Absolutely. Well, I'll start by saying there are probably 3 things that mums might be needing to ask for support for. And knowing the words to use when you're asking for support is really helpful, right? So the first is either feeling low in mood or really anxious after having your baby or during pregnancy. In the NHS, we call that perinatal mental health support. So any mum listening could go to their GP, health visitor, or midwife and say, I think I might need some perinatal mental health support. And that would be understood to mean support for your mood or for really strong feelings of worry. Midwives, health visitors, and GPs are really good at normalizing kind of everyday worries and feelings that parents have, and being able to identify when those feelings and worries might tip you into a group of people who might need some extra support. And the sorts of extra support that would be available would be talking therapies, typically in the first instance, to help you make sense of your experiences, your thoughts, and your feelings, and enable you to feel a little bit better about your experience as either a pregnant mum or a new parent. The second type of support that people might need help with might be birth trauma. So very fitting that we're thinking about that here. But it's worth saying that that's different to perinatal mental health support. So you might be struggling with big feelings of anxiety and low mood and not have experienced a traumatic birth, or you might have had a traumatic birth and also be experiencing those perinatal mental health difficulties. So worth kind of parents being aware that they can be separate. For that sort of experience, it might be that they're having flashbacks related to their traumatic birth. It might be that they're struggling to sleep, and not because baby is crying, but just because they can't settle their mind, even though they feel really fatigued and really tired. They might feel like that constant sense of adrenaline, their heart is beating really quickly. If they notice those sorts of symptoms, then specifically saying, I think I might be experiencing some trauma in relation to my birth, would get them to the sort of support that they need. Again, that might be a talking therapy, and there's a particular type of therapy called EMDR that is really helpful and generally achieves some quite quick success for mums who've experienced that. And again, GPs, health visitors, midwives will be able to signpost you into those services. And then the third and final area that mums might need some support with is building their relationship with the baby. So that can in some ways feel the hardest to talk about. So it might be that mums are feeling like it's really hard for them to know what their baby wants. That my baby's just crying. I just don't know, how to meet their needs or kind of what they're looking for. It might be that they're feeling really overwhelmed by the task of parenting, and kind of hopeless and helpless about how to go about breastfeeding and changing the nappies and waking at night, and that kind of general sense of being really overwhelmed by the task of caring for a baby. Or it might be that mums are just feeling really not confident that they're doing a good enough job. And I can think about lots of families that I've supported where mums have really lacked confidence. Even when you see through the baby's eyes, they're doing a brilliant job of meeting their baby's needs. But their sense is that they're just not good enough. And that's what gets in the way of their enjoyment of their role as a new parent. So if that's kind of feeling familiar to any of your listeners, I'd be encouraging them to talk about support for building their relationship with their baby.
Mm.
Well, that is such useful advice. Go ahead, Andrea. Anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that over 30 years, I've been involved with a lot of charities that provide psychotherapeutic support for new families. And very often I'm not a therapist myself, but very often therapists have told me that the first feeling of mum or dad or both of them is, our baby just hates us. My baby doesn't like me at all. Or my baby's really naughty. He's just constantly naughty. And that, of course, is we're putting sort of grown up feelings and actions upon a baby that can't do any of those things. A baby is trying to survive and trying to form a secure attachment with you. So babies aren't naughty, and they absolutely do not hate you. And so the one thing I can say here with any shadow of a doubt is your baby adores you. You are your baby's lifeline, and actually your baby's also not naughty. So I mean, just to add to that, with lots of relationship issues, it's very often it's us as the adults that are feeling anxious and worried, and the baby's perfectly fine. It's us.
I think that's so true, isn't it? Because in any other situation, if we were having a conversation now and you were screaming at me, then I'd be thinking, gosh, this person really doesn't like me very much. But your baby screams to communicate a need that they have. And that need isn't that they hate you. But we are so well trained as grown-ups to, if somebody's got big feelings and they're showing us for 12 hours a day what their big feelings are, then they must not like us very much. So our mind is very helpful at helping us understand most situations, but sometimes that can make us fall down a little bit when we have a baby. So understanding that that is different when babies are crying, they're just communicating their needs. And it's also especially important to understand that if you've experienced a traumatic birth, because it might be that your baby experienced some trauma in that birthing process too. So if we think about some of the birth methods that can be really quite painful for babies, thinking about forceps, for example, it might be that your baby is experiencing more pain and therefore they might cry more. And that's really difficult for parents who have also experienced a traumatic birth, because they will have a baby that needs more soothing at a time when they maybe have not very much left in their emotional bucket to give. And so if that is the case for parents listening, knowing that that's not your fault and leaning on support wherever it is around you, whether that's your friends, your family, your partner, or a professional support network through a family hub, your GP, health visitor, midwife. You absolutely have to find your village, as Andrea said earlier.
Well, that's such useful practical advice. And it reminds me, when I was a politician, I was campaigning a lot for mums in their 6-week GP appointment to be asked about their physical and mental health, as well as the baby. So I really appreciate that helpful list. And Andrea, you're a mum who's, suffered from many of these issues yourself. And there are mums listening to the show today who would love to know what your advice is to them, particularly on the mental health support, if they're feeling like they can't ask and they are worried about sharing those symptoms with friends or wider family. What advice would you like to give them, and where should they seek help?
Yeah, so I mean, my children are now almost 30, 27 and 21. So when I was having children, it was a while ago. And it's not clear to me that things have changed as much as they should have done in the intervening period. And I do think that there does need to be a lot more help for people in the profession to be more empathetic and trauma informed in terms of the way that they treat families. And I do think our midwifery and our house visiting professions are amazing. But I do think that sometimes their physical focus can be quite harsh on parents, as Matt said earlier, on dads as well as on mums. There's a couple of things I'd say. First of all, if I had my time again, I would try to make sure that the people who are actually caring for me understood how I was feeling. And the trouble is, when you're scared because it's your first baby, I mean, my mum once said to me that there isn't a woman on earth who doesn't think at some point during giving birth that she's going to die, which is quite shocking. I mean, how many times in your life do you actually think you're going to die? Maybe if you're in a rocky flight somewhere, you might have that feeling. But actually, it is true. When you're giving birth, you're like, actually, I'd quite like to leave now. Can someone else take over? And it is on you. This is on you. This baby's coming out. And so that is very terrifying. And I think communicating that to your professionals around you is so important. And different people respond differently to that. I think for me, having my mum there was incredibly valuable. Having a supportive husband was incredibly valuable. I was so lucky in that regard. I also had very supportive sisters who neither of whom had had children at the time. And so that was completely terrifying for them, but they wanted to be there. So they were both, at sort of beck and call to come over. So the network is so important. And really, my heart goes out to people who don't have that network. And what I would say is fabulous charities like Home Start and going to your family hub where there are people who want to sort of volunteer. There are peer supporters who will come along and make you a cup of tea and say, oh, I know, I went through that. Whenever I speak to a mum who's had a tough time, I always make a point of saying, oh, that happened to me. I absolutely get it. Because people want empathy. They want to feel I'm not alone. I'm not the first or only person who's ever had this feeling that, my baby hates me or I've failed somehow. So actually, it is on all of us. As I said earlier, if you see a crying baby, don't like at the parents, just entertain the baby, be the baby whisperer. I mean, I know we're all very wary equally of going up to someone else's baby, but on a flight, sometimes, the parents like, oh, great, someone else is going to talk to my baby for a minute. Thank you so much. So, within the bounds, I think all of us should at least make the point of feeling empathy and kindness towards someone when they're having a tough time with their baby.
Absolutely. I think that's a good time to bring in the work of your new project, Andrea. So I know you set up the 1001 Days Critical Foundation. Could you just explain to listeners what that is and what is the support that you're going to be giving families in the future?
Yes, so the foundation is the greatest project ever, and we are going to change the world. There is no doubt in my mind. I feel this is a subject whose time has come. I think the work you're doing on breaking the taboo is brilliant, but everywhere over the last 30 years, there has been this groundswell of interest, knowledge, enthusiasm for giving every baby the best start for life. And that's what the 1001 Critical Days Foundation is trying to do. Our motto, if you like, is we are determined that every baby should experience the best start for life. And we focus on the babies, but of course, the parents are utterly integral to the experience of the baby. So ultimately, the foundation wants to promote better support for parents and carers to deliver better outcomes for babies. So the foundation will do three things. One is it will provide grant funding to charities that are delivering services in family hub type settings that will deliver better outcomes for families and their babies. Secondly, is we are commissioning groundbreaking research from around the world on what works best to deliver better outcomes for babies. How good is therapeutic baby massage versus first aid for babies for dads versus time for me, a stay and play? What are the best sort of interventions to help parents with their confidence levels, etc.? But also, how important is the infant gut biome? How concerning should it be that so many babies are left in front of devices? So we're trying to improve the knowledge base and also look at the finances, frankly, the sharp end. So how much money could we save the taxpayer by investing earlier in the antenatal period so that fewer children have speech delay, fewer children go to school not school ready and anxious, and so on and so on. So that research is critical to what we're doing. And then the third thing we're doing is advocating around the world for the 1001 critical days. And that means persuading governments around the world to have a budget for the perinatal period. In the same way as we all have budgets for schools from age 4, we should have a budget for the perinatal period to enable every baby to get the best start.
Well, that's such an important project, Andrea, and I'm pleased to hear you're taking it around the world, because we know we need to be talking more to policymakers. And it struck me, listening to what you were just saying, Andrea, that there's still just not enough stuff being talked about this in terms of policy. And I think there's also a wider point about women's health often just being ignored by governments. And obviously you were a cabinet minister in the UK government. Why do you think it is that women's health is so often ignored by parliaments?
Oh, how long have we got? I mean, it is extraordinary. And I do think one of the problems is that women's voices are just not as well heard as men's voices. And unfortunately, one of the biggest problems we have in the Best Start for Every Baby is the extent to which it's seen as a women's thing. And of course it's not, it's a family thing. There are two people involved in every case, in having that baby, in creating that baby. And actually, it's to the detriment of society, to politics, to everything, that dads and other partners are so written out of the picture. Right from the very beginning, where the midwife's asking mum how she is and not referring to dad who sat there in the room, hello, hello, and he is ignored all the way through. And unfortunately, that is where our society is right now. So if I was to say, the one reason is because it's seen as a women's thing, not a men's thing. It's the same with issues of menopause, with period pains, endometriosis, all of the things that are actually quite life-changing and awful for women. You just have to shut up about it. No one's interested. No one's going to give you the time of day. If anything, it's embarrassing. Don't talk to me about your period pains. So actually making it more relevant to men, I think, unfortunately, is absolutely key here. But also, it would be a positive win-win, because making the whole family, the creation of a new baby, much more relevant to men by bringing men in, so many, the vast majority of whom desperately want to be more brought into it. But if you did that, if you made it a topic that is relevant to everybody, I think you could solve that problem where women's health, babies' health, family health is so little talked about in cabinet. But you're absolutely right. I mean, when I was in cabinet, the favourite thing of some of my male colleagues when I raised the issue of babies in cabinet was, oh, Leadsom's banging on about babies again. I kid you not, that was the phrase. And they all had it. Leadsom's banging on about babies again. And I would say, yeah, absolutely. And I'll carry on till the day I die. Get over it. It's just unbelievable, the extent of babies. Who cares? And it's just got to stop. We've got to change it.
And I think something I wrote about in my book, Breaking the Taboo, was how we just don't have enough women politicians, and therefore democracy is being affected because we don't have enough women legislators who are therefore looking at these issues. So a bigger project, I think, for the UK government to look at gender parity. But I think that leads us on very well to the two final questions that I ask every guest on Breaking the Taboo. And the first is, we do know that politicians are listening to the podcast. So Matt, if I could start with you, if you had the Health Secretary on the line today and you could tell him one thing to do to improve care for new mums and babies, what would you like the government to do?
Well, I wonder if I could build on what Andrea just said and think about an opportunity that the UK government could take right now, which is to make sure that babies and women's health is also considered as part of the men's health strategy. So, if we really want to prioritize babies and think about how babies can have the best start in life, then we need to be thinking about how we support dads. If we support dads, we support mums. And the men's health strategy is a very live opportunity for us to do that. So for me, it would be look at the evidence on the importance of dads and co-parents in the lives of babies and the lives of mums, and think about how we can make sure that we're thinking about the whole family system, because that's what's going to enable babies to flourish and thrive.
Absolutely. And Andrew, you were a politician, so I'm sure you have lots of art. But if you had to pick one key one for the new Labour government, what would you like them to do and why?
So I talked a lot to Labour ministers before they became the ministers, and I know that there is huge cross-party consensus on the importance of the best start for every baby. And I was delighted that the new government has continued with the funding and, in fact, the expansion of family hubs right around England. That's so important. But I think the real beginning of a conclusion in terms of the development of the 1001 critical days policy around the world, for me, will be when every single government around the world has a budget annually for the period from pregnancy to age 2 that goes beyond just midwifery services and health visiting services. So if you think back to the 1944 Education Act, where it was decided that every child would have schooling, every child forever. And now, if you took your 4-year-old to a primary school, you would be horrified if they said, actually, sorry, we're not bothering with reception in this county. You'll have to move to the county next door. But actually, that is what we do with perinatal support. So we've got health visiting and midwifery. But other than that, there is very little that is constantly budgeted for. And even the budgets for health visitors and midwives ebb and flow. So an annual budget that is completely repeated every single year in every country around the world, that would be the one thing I would call on every government to do.
Well, let's hope that Wes Streeting is listening to this today and will be taking action on all of the above. And we also like to keep this series really practical for families listening. So is there one particular resource that you'd like to signpost new mums and their partners and family to? And Matt, if I could start with you.
Gosh, I love reading parenting books. I've read more than I'd care to admit, but I think my favorite is The Book You Wish Your Parents Had Read. It does a really nice job of explaining to parents how our own experiences of early being parented when we were babies and young children has an influence on the way in which we build relationships with our babies and meet their needs, or struggle to meet their needs. And I think it's a really brilliant book that every parent really should read.
Absolutely, that's a great suggestion. And Andrea, what would you like to direct listeners to?
So I think from a very practical point of view, I would direct listeners to the NHS's Start for Life section of its website, because that is full of how to find things that you might need and full of tips and practical advice. So I think that as a straight resource is really, really good. But for parents who really want to understand more about the relationship between babies and their parents, I would encourage them to perhaps read something like a new book that's been written by Sue Gerhardt, who I worked with 30 years ago. She's a psychotherapist and worked for a long time at Oxpip, which provided support for families with perinatal issues. She's written a new book called The 1001 Critical Days. And if you really want to understand how it is that all of our lifelong emotional and physical health is created, and you're interested in a long read, then I would recommend that.
Brilliant. Well, those are such good suggestions. Although I appreciate mums don't always have the time to read, but I'm sure they have audiobooks that you can listen to driving in the car on the school run. Well, can I thank both of my guests today for coming on Breaking the Taboo to talk about baby bonding and the importance of the 1001 critical days. It's been a pleasure to have you on today's show. And if you've been enjoying Breaking the Taboo and this series, then do rate us on Apple iTunes or Spotify. And please do share this episode with friends and family. We want as many people who are affected to find access to the help and the support that they need. So stay tuned for next week's episode of Breaking the Taboo. Bye-bye for now.